The unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine continues. Ever since the end of the Ukrainian summer counter-offensive in 2023, the Russians have regained strategic momentum. They're trying to make the most of it before Ukraine gets more weapons from its allies and mobilizes more soldiers to mitigate the manpower shortage. Welcome to another Kings and Generals update on the war in Ukraine. This week, our YouTube members and patrons will continue watching our series on the Second Punic War, with the video on the Battle of Lake Trasimene, the engagement that made Rome panic and bring Fabius Maximus to power. The support of YouTube members and patrons allows us to continue releasing these free videos without worrying about the unstable YouTube ad revenue and lets us be more choosy in terms of our sponsors. You can join their ranks via the links in the description and get access to 2 weekly exclusive videos, with more than 150 right now, including the series on the Pacific War, Fall of Sparta, First and Second Punic Wars, Russian revolutions and the Civil War, Italian reunification wars, Albigensian Crusade, History of Prussia, Biography of Sulla, the Reconquista, the World War II North African Campaign, the Persian Wars, and much more. Thanks for your kind support. The difficult situation on the battlefield continues for Ukraine, and that will likely be the case for the next few months. The only positive news for the Ukrainians on the battlefield was from the Kharkiv front and the Serebryansky forest of the Luhansk Oblast. By now, we can comfortably say that the Russian offensive on Kharkiv has failed, once again for the second time in this war. Both sides are still gaining and losing ground in the Kharkiv Oblast, but both the battles in Vovchansk and Lipsy have turned into positional affairs. Ukraine has managed to stop the Russians. In the Serebryansky forest, another site of a months-long battle, the Ukrainians have made considerable gains in July. But everywhere else, the Ukrainian defenders have lost ground to the Russians. On the North Luhansk front, the Russians have pierced through Ukrainian defenses near Pishchana, capturing this village and overall advancing for more than 4 kilometers in depth on July 21st. In Donbass, the situation for the Ukrainians continues to deteriorate as the Russians keep advancing in several sectors. In Chasiv Yar, they captured the Canal micro-district after 3 months of very intense combat on July 3rd. The Russians are also making quick gains in the Turgetsk sector. Battles in this area intensified in June, and the Ukrainian defenses are having a hard time here. On July 3rd, the Russian army advanced 3 kilometers deep into Pivnishche and Selizne, along with entering Druzhba. According to Ukrainian military observers, once again the Russians took advantage of the Ukrainian unit rotation to achieve this minor breakthrough. In late June, the Ukrainian command sent the 24th Mechanized Brigade from the Turgetsk sector to Chasiv Yar, while the 41st Mechanized Brigade was sent from Chasiv Yar to Turgetsk. Something went wrong, and the Russians exploited the opportunity. As a result, the Ukrainian command was forced to send in the 95th Air Assault Brigade and the 32nd Mechanized Brigade to stabilize this sector. Since then, the Russians have also gained ground in New York. The situation in the Ocheretina sector continues to deteriorate as well. At the beginning of July, the Ukrainian command decided to withdraw to the eastern shore of the Kalivska Reservoir, which is on high ground. However, this advantage did not prevent the Russians from making further gains in this sector. On July 4th, they captured Voskod. 3 days later, Yevhenivka fell. On July 14th, the Russians captured Lozovetska. Then they took Prohrez, encircling 2 battalions of the 31st Brigade. Taking hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers prisoner would have been a major propaganda coup for Russia and a significant hit on Ukrainian morale. But they managed to break the encirclement and withdraw to join fellow AFU units. Still, this did not mean that the Ukrainians had managed to stabilize the situation in the Ocheretina sector. Later in July, the Russians captured Novoselivka Persha and Vovche. This is creating a perilous situation for Ukraine in this sector. The Russians are advancing on Pokrovsk on 2 axes. Pokrovsk is a crucial logistical node for the Ukrainian defense of Donbass, notably for Chasiv Yar and Turgetsk. Much of Donbass may be captured if Pokrovsk falls. The Russians are also advancing on 2 other roads, albeit at a much slower pace. They have gained ground towards Maximilianivka and inside Konstantinivka despite massive losses at times. For instance, on July 25th, Russia sent in at least 11 tanks, 45 infantry fighting vehicles, an armored fighting vehicle, and 12 motorcycles to Ukrainian positions in Konstantinivka. This column was devastated by the Ukrainian 79th Brigade, which destroyed 6 tanks, 7 infantry fighting vehicles, and all 12 motorcycles, along with dozens of infantrymen. But as we have said many times in our videos, The Russians are comfortable taking these losses if it means they continue advancing. Some reports suggest that the level of recruitment to the Russian army is behind the anticipated numbers, as the peak of the claimed 30,000 new recruits per month may have now passed. However, the Russian government is still offering very enticing terms to new recruits. A recruit from Moscow gets almost $20,000 as a signing bonus. If he survives for a year, he gets more than $60,000 at the end of that year. That is a huge number for ordinary Russians. The Ukrainian commander-in-chief, Syrskyi, claims that there are 520,000 Russian soldiers involved in the war in Ukraine. At this point, it looks like it's more than enough to advance. And in Donbass, they do. And not just in sectors which have been hot for months, but in areas that have been relatively quiet in recent months. For instance, they have reportedly captured Sperna and Ivano-Derivka, which means that they intend to advance on Siversk, another important logistics area for Ukraine. The Russian army still largely relies on the mass bombardment of Ukrainian positions to deny them any cover against mass frontal attacks by the Russian so-called meat assaults. But they are also adapting their behavior on the battlefield and using new tactics. Ukrainian soldiers of the 47th Brigade told the Times correspondent Maxim Tucker that the Russians have started fighting smarter. They rely on intelligence to target weaker units rather than weak fortifications as they used to do. They bring hundreds of FPV drone operators to the front and use new frequencies that the Ukrainian electronic warfare tools have not identified yet. Then they attack in very small groups of 3 to 4 soldiers, hide from drones in tree lines, identify weak points or weak units in the Ukrainian defenses, then call in artillery and drone strikes. After the smaller group manages to gain a foothold, a larger infantry group is sent in for the main assault. The Russians have lately tried to avoid direct confrontations with Ukrainian elite units and attack their flanks, manned by weaker and less experienced units. And when these weaker units fall back, the elite units often have to do the same to avoid being flanked or encircled by the Russians. As a result, the Ukrainian army loses ground. The Russians have also captured Uruzhaina, another town liberated by the Ukrainian army during their counter-offensive, and the failed Ukrainian bridgehead on the left bank of Kherson Oblast in Krinky. The latter was a site of particularly bloody battles. Months ago, the Ukrainian army liberated Krinky to use it as a bridgehead for future operations on the left bank. But the Russians constantly brought reinforcements and regularly bombarded Ukrainian positions to prevent any threat coming from this area. 262 confirmed KIA and 788 MIA later, according to Ukrainian sources, the Ukrainian Marines were forced to leave Krinky. Reports coming from Ukraine blame the failed operation in Krinky and significant losses suffered in this campaign on the recently dismissed General Sudol. We have talked many times about the causes of the recent struggles of the Ukrainian army, particularly in Donbass. Manpower and weapon shortages are still mentioned as the primary reasons. For instance, the commander-in-chief Syrskyi stated in his interview that the Ukrainians have a massive shortage of short-range air defense missiles, which prevent them shooting down Russian drones. President Zelensky also complained in an interview with Bloomberg about the slow delivery of promised Western equipment, and this prevents Kyiv from equipping new brigades. The commander of the Ukrainian forces in the Chasiv Yar sector also stated that his brigade needed more ammunition than manpower. But since Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines continue complaining of exhaustion and insufficient rotation of troops, along with the shortage of troops in Donbass, the lack of manpower is likely still a problem for Ukraine. Even though, according to the New York Times, Ukraine has mobilized 30,000 troops since the adoption of the mobilization bill in May. Perhaps they have been mobilized but are still being trained. Most likely, the manpower and firepower issues come hand in hand. More promised weapons should arrive in Ukraine before the AFU is capable of fielding new brigades and more men. And promises are being made. On July 9th and 10th, several important decisions were made at the NATO summit held in Washington, D.C. NATO members signed a declaration pledging at least 40 billion euros of military aid to be given to Ukraine within the next year. Kyiv signed several security agreements with NATO members. Ukraine's allies agreed to establish a joint training center for Ukrainian troops in Bydgoszcz, Poland. American, Dutch, German, Italian and Romanian leaders pledged to provide 5 additional Patriot systems. The United States also made a joint statement with Canada, Norway, Spain and Britain, pledging to send more air defense systems to Ukraine. The Netherlands and Denmark reiterated that their F-16s will arrive in Ukraine in the summer of 2024. The Dutch Ministry of Defence also promised an additional €300 million to purchase ammunition for F-16s. The Norwegian Prime Minister pledged 6 F-16s to Kyiv. Speaking of the F-16s, on the last day of the month, Ukrainian sources published a video of at least one of these aircraft flying over Lviv. The fact that they have been shown over the city prompted some analysts to claim that the F-16s will initially be used for air defense roles, but we'll see. Promises and declarations of military support were made outside of the NATO summit too. The United States pledged weapons and equipment worth over $4 billion in July, including a new Patriot battery, ammunition for Patriot, HIMARS, Hawk, NASAMS, Javelin and AT-4 anti-tank guns, artillery shells, TOW and Stinger missiles, electronic warfare tools, explosives, small arms, hand grenades and so on. Czechia reiterated it's going to deliver 500,000 shells to Ukraine this year. The first 50,000 shells were delivered in June. Spain has delivered 10 Leopard 2A4 tanks, which it promised a while ago. There are not many at all, but it is still the first delivery of modern tanks since the arrival of Abrams tanks. On July 19th, Britain signed an agreement with Ukraine, committing to give £2 billion of loans for weapon procurement to be repaid in 15 years. Lastly, on July 22nd, the EU Foreign Policy Chief Borrell announced that the first tranche of €1.4 billion from proceeds from frozen Russian assets would be given to Ukraine for more weapon purchases. On the Russian side, the most notable report is the Bloomberg claim that China may produce Shahed drones to then sell to Russia. The report is based on claims of 2 unspecified European officials, stating that Russian and Chinese companies have talked about developing Shaheds in China. For now, this report has not been confirmed, but if it ends up being true, it would be a massive blow to Ukraine. Shahed drones are quite cheap to produce, and the Russians tend to send them in large numbers. Ukraine is being forced to use very expensive air defense systems to shoot them down. If the Chinese industrial machine starts producing Shahed drones, the numbers may become just absolutely overwhelming for the Ukrainian air defenses. Ukraine is trying to push China away from an alliance with Russia. On July 24th to 25th, the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba visited China and met his counterpart. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated that Ukraine supports the principle of one China, while Kuleba asserted that his Chinese colleague supported Ukraine's territorial integrity. He also stated that he was happy with how the talks went, and bemoaned the apparent rivalry between the Ukrainian and Chinese peace plans. Even Hungary is trying to find a diplomatic solution to the war in Ukraine, or just helping the Kremlin to push its narrative, depending on your perspective. As you probably know, the Hungarian Prime Minister Orbán has been advocating for stopping the Western military aid for Ukraine, and is generally viewed as a pro-Russian leader in the world. Orbán met with Zelensky and Putin, and praised the Russian president, but otherwise his shuttle diplomacy did not amount to much. Orbán urged both leaders to consider a ceasefire, but was dismissed in both cases. Zelensky fears that Russia will use any ceasefire to build up its forces to attack Ukraine later once again, and during their joint press conference, Putin openly rejected a ceasefire too. Putin believes that he has the upper hand and is confident in his attrition strategy. Instead, Putin prefers a quote-unquote final solution to the war. And what does this preferred solution look like? In June, Putin demanded recognition of Russian sovereignty over all territories of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, even though those have not yet been occupied. In July, he demanded the withdrawal of the Ukrainian forces from Novorossiya, a region which now exists only in the minds of Russian ultra-nationalists. It includes the Kherson, Odessa and Mykolaiv regions. On top of that, Putin insists on demilitarization, which effectively means that the Ukrainian army would be turned into an entity with an utter inability to resist any further Russian incursions. And if Putin's demands seem delusional to you, former President Medvedev has once again gone further than Putin. He claimed that Ukraine should cease to exist by 2034. Previously, Medvedev stated that Ukraine should not be a sovereign state, and while it is, this is going to constitute a grave threat to Russian security. So, in a nutshell, Russia demands a complete capitulation from Ukraine. But despite Ukraine's struggles in Donbass, it is not like Russia is on the brink of routing the Ukrainian army on the battlefield. As long as Western military aid flows into Ukraine, that will continue to be the case. Thus, the Russian demands are unrealistic and outlandish, at least at this point. The Czech President Petr Pavel summarized the current situation and how it may affect the negotiations. He believes that for Ukraine, the liberation of all the occupied territories is an unrealistic task. Having said that, he also argues that Russia should not expect a major breakthrough on the battlefield either in the foreseeable future. Thus, Pavel called to persuade the Russians as soon as possible that they won't achieve any meaningful gains, which is why they should sit with Ukraine. The Czech president added that the Western position should not be about the legalization of the Russian control over the occupied territories, as they should consider them temporarily occupied. There is rarely a solution that satisfies both sides in wars if neither side has a clear advantage, and this has been the case in this war since 2023. It seems like public opinion about the outcome of the war has somewhat shifted in Ukraine too. In May, the European Council of Foreign Relations conducted a poll in which 45% of Ukrainians stated that they would prefer to maintain sovereignty and its army and get NATO and EU membership, even if Ukraine loses its currently occupied territories. 26% of Ukrainians preferred to regain all occupied territories in exchange for demilitarization and neutrality. So there is some degree of understanding that Ukraine may permanently lose its territories to Russia in the Ukrainian public. However, the problem is that there's still no guarantee that Ukraine will be accepted into NATO. You would think that after all the things that Ukraine has gone through, and the fact that it now has one of the strongest and most experienced armies in the Western Alliance, would make Ukraine a guaranteed member of NATO after the war. But so far, the Western leaders have been reluctant to give any ironclad commitments. According to French President Macron, the United States and Germany are the main opponents of Ukraine's accession to NATO. One last thing we need to discuss here is the impact of Donald Trump's potential presidency. The former Prime Minister of Britain, Boris Johnson, who is considered both a staunch ally of Ukraine and Trump, argued that Trump understands that Ukraine's defeat would be a catastrophe for the United States. Johnson thinks that the Russian victory would mean an increased threat from China to Taiwan, from Hezbollah to Israel, and from Russia to the Baltics. If the United States fails to act in these potential wars, the Americans will lose any claim to global leadership. That is why Trump would be interested in finding a favorable solution for Ukraine and the West, which may be the return of the pre-24th of February 2024 de facto borders. He added that the Ukrainian soldiers may substitute the American troops in Europe after the war, which would be a significant money-saving opportunity for the United States. Johnson suggested persuading reluctant Putin into this deal by arming Ukraine to the teeth, giving official rights to the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine, and the restoration of global relations with Russia. Basically, it is an off-ramp for Putin from this war to gloat about victory at home without actually achieving it. But Trump named J.D. Vance, an outspoken critic of any military aid to Ukraine, as his vice president nominee. There are fears in Ukraine that Trump's presidency would have disastrous results for the supply of the Ukrainian army, and Zelensky personally and his government are working hard to persuade Trump from abandoning Ukraine. So to summarize, more powers are trying to find a diplomatic solution to end the brutal war in Ukraine. But the main problem remains the same. Ukraine and Russia insist on radically different things, and at this point it is difficult to find common ground, even though neither side looks primed to defeat the other on the battlefield. Let's conclude with the visually confirmed equipment losses on both sides, compiled by the Oryx blog. As of July 31st, Russia has lost at least 3,286 tanks, 7,185 armored vehicles, 284 command posts and communication stations, 1,311 artillery systems and vehicles, 398 multiple rocket launchers, 121 aircraft and 138 helicopters. Ukraine has lost at least 877 tanks, 2,751 armored vehicles, 19 command posts and communication stations, 618 artillery systems and vehicles, 77 multiple rocket launchers, 97 aircraft and 47 helicopters. Further updates on the war in Ukraine are on the way. To make sure you don't miss them, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.